Wakanda forever. How are y'all doing out there? I am Marilyn E. Thornton. I work here at the United Methodist Publishing House, creating resources that use African American culture and history as a springboard for development. Now, we are coming to you from the studio at the house, as we like to call it. And we invite you to continue the conversation about Black Panther, the movie that has taken the world, and I do mean the world, by a storm. So let's go ahead and plug Victor Leon Cyrus-Franklin in. He has a great intelligence and love for the Lord, and he wrote the official Bible study for the first season of WGN's Underground series. Victor Leon, how are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful today. How are you?
I am good. So glad to talk with you.
Good. Yes, glad to be here.
Mm-hmm. We have Cecilia Olusola Tribble, who is a community and organizational development coordinator for Metro Arts in the Nashville Office of Arts and Culture. She designs and leads programs that reduce racism and provide restorative justice, creating arts opportunities for minoritized persons through grants and education. And right now we also have with us Matthew Charlton, who is based in Nashville, Tennessee, in his role as the Assistant General Secretary for Collegiate Ministries of the United Methodist Church. He has visited college campuses and met with students all over the United States and the world. He has also taught theology at Methodist Theological School in Ohio. How are you all doing this afternoon?
Really awesome.
We're doing great.
Excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, you are welcome.
Yeah, I would have to agree and just and connect it to that as far as folks who are in the church world, if you will. Mm-hmm. I think it helps us wrestle with the idea of paradise and what paradise is.
Mm-hmm. Paradox.
We speak of Wakanda as a utopia, or as a paradise. Mm-hmm. And for many of us, that's a draw to the idea of a Wakanda, a place that was untouched by colonialism. Well, so what would Africa be? What would African peoples be if the abundant resources of Africa and the people of Africa were untouched by European interference via colonialization and abuse, really? Mm-hmm. So it wrestles with this idea of paradise. And relative to the Killmonger character and T'Challa, one of the things the film wrestles with is how Killmonger is a creation of the kind of leadership that had existed, in the Wakandan nation. And so I'm reminded, there's a quote from Toni Morrison where she says, all paradises, all utopias are defined by who is not there. They're defined by the people who are not allowed in. And so, in a sense, that's a principle of Wakanda. It was a paradise because it was isolationist and really disconnected itself, from other peoples. But as a result, created this person in Killmonger because they had that isolationist stance. And so, which is part of the reason why he's such an empathetic character for so many who watch the film. He's not a villain for many of us, but for many of us, he speaks a truth that we identify with. Now he's very villainous because his path to the crown is paved in blood, and he counted by the scars that are on his body, and so his disrespect and neglect, hurt of life, is very apparent. But his experience is one many of us identify with because we feel that we've been the ones that have been locked out of paradise. Yeah, and so I think that's important in wrestling with what that means, because in a very real way, it's in some ways, if we talk about a paradise biblically, the Garden of Eden, for some is a good image of paradise. Another one is heaven. And so what we see is kind of a correlation is, the seeds that kind of hurt begin very early. And so what may seem on the surface as a civilization that is perfect and harmonious, the way it can be held together in some very nefarious ways that do harm. And so I think that raises some questions for us in terms of what, quote, paradise, is for us and how we live into it.
So less than Garden of Eden, but more the coming kingdom? You know, how do we have the opportunity to learn from the history, the past, even the Afrofuturistic representation of Wakanda, of how we live into the kingdom of God, if you will, a kingdom where the lion lays down with the lamb, and where everybody is included. All those are healed. Everyone's freed. What you said about...
I'm sorry if I may, I'm sorry if I may. And also that becomes the question for T'Challa through the end of the film.
Yes.
Is how to break from the pattern of history from the Black Panthers and the kings and the royalty before him, you know, in his lineage, in order to chart a new course that's open to those kinds of possibilities. I found it very interesting in the latter part of the film when after he and Killmonger had their fight and Killmonger is dying, and he offers an invitation to Killmonger to live, and Killmonger chooses not to, you know, saying he was standing in the tradition of his ancestors who jumped the slave ships, you know, and he said because he did not want to be incarcerated. And T'Challa does not say, T'Challa doesn't respond because Wakanda does not have a concept of restorative justice yet. Okay. He doesn't have a response for Killmonger because here he says, you're right, we don't know what restorative justice means. So this opens a possibility for exploring what does restorative justice look like in Wakanda, which also raises the question for us, what does restorative justice look like in our own community?
All right.
That's a great point. I mean, one thing about this movie that it allows for us to imagine Blackness that is not defined by whiteness, right? Which is a tool of colonization, right? Colonization, I mean, race happened as a result of conquest. It made, you know, race was necessary for white supremacy, right, of the globe, right? And so to imagine a free state that is completely self-defined by its own vision of itself, that is not tainted by colonization, is something psychically, emotionally, and spiritually reparative, I think, to see on the screen in many different ways. I guess I'll go here. The reparative turn for me happened on a few levels as a Black person, as an African-American person, a person who is Pan-African, or what people call an Atlantic Black person. What is reparative for me was that line when T'Challa is facing death and his father is welcoming him home to, you know, be dead with the other kings. And T'Challa's like, well, I'm not ready to go back. And he is asking him the question, why did you abandon the child, right? This, yeah, and I think for me, that is a question that people who come from enslaved Africans around the globe our culture wants to ask that question, you know, because it's not as if Africa was an unwilling partner in our enslavement, right? And so, Africa was a willing partner in many instances to fortify their own kingdoms and their own enrichment in the beginning, right? And so I think that's the question that we are begging to know, you know, why was money more important than us, you know? And even just to ask a question, even though there is not an answer, was very cathartic for me, I think, in that moment, and for many others.
I think the point you raise is echoed throughout the film, with the anxiety about Wakanda being an isolated community.
Yeah.
If they're open to the world in the ways that other countries and nations are, is their way of life threatened?
Right.
Will the material wealth that they experience as a culture, will that be taken?
Mm-hmm.
Will more powerful nations come along and try to steal it? Those themes are echoed throughout this film. The anxiety of having a good thing and legitimately being worried that everybody else wants to take it from you.
Right.
Because you do have a good thing. You have a beautiful culture.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe it was the first royal council after T'Challa, the new king, is it the Black Panther?
Mm-hmm.
When he gathers the first people together, and he talks about how can we share what Wakanda has with folks throughout the world to raise their quality of life.
Right.
And why would we let them come here?
Why would we let them come here?
Right.
And do we really? And some of the counselors, the elders, were saying, why would we want people to know about the place that we have?
Mm-hmm.
Because everything would then be at risk.
Right.
So I think in representing Wakanda as a culture with a lot of material and cultural wealth, they also showed that they did not see themselves, or the movie did not portray them as a perfect culture. They weren't portrayed as a paradise. Perhaps they were more portrayed as a utopia. I think one of the previous people I was listening to, Victor,
yes,
was talking about Wakanda as a kind of utopia. And of course, the original understanding of what utopia was from Thomas More was a place that had the kind of seemed like paradise, but in order for paradise to actually happen, there were all kinds of restrictive rules. Mm-hmm. You couldn't go here without someone knowing that you were there. You couldn't cross this line. So utopia did not look utopian itself. It had a lot of struggles, and I appreciate the filmmakers showing that Wakanda is a beautiful culture with a beautiful people with a lot to offer the world, but not portraying it as a perfect place, as a paradise, as a Garden of Eden.
That's one thing that is so great about this movie, is that none of the characters or the place fall into either binary, right? That, there is always, there is a sort of moral conflict between what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is just, what do we have to lose? Everything, even as this is a beautiful place, a utopian place, it is still, very fearful of sorts, right?
Well, that's one thing that came up earlier. The quote that Matt was referring to was from Toni Morrison. Victor brought it up. All utopians are defined by people who are not there. Mm-hmm. All right. And I think that also to really, even looking at the anti-hero, if you will, no one was looked upon, no one was presented as being all one thing or the other. And the tension was there from the very beginning when the coming king, T'Challa, is coming to come into his power. He's got to go get Nakia, is that her name? Yeah, Nakia, the Nyong'o character. And what she is doing, all right, she is interacting with the present in the world, all right, in trying to rescue women who have been stolen. And then there's a boy who was a soldier who had also been stolen from his, which is something that is current and present and happening in Africa today. And she said where she was coming from Nigeria. All right. So all of these things, nothing is presented as being perfect, even as we can still imagine, well, what would any part of Africa have been like if there had not been all of this interference?
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise an important point about, I was just reading about really the loss of a home place that, Pan-Africans struggle with, when thinking about where we are from. And I think the movie really highlights the fact that we have created a home place in our culture. And it is so our home place, which is, the way that that handshake that happens, the, crossing the arms across the chest, even the way that I can't call the character's name. The general talks about her wig being, why do I have to have this on? Oh, guns are so, even just the attitude of it, the
primitive.
way guns are so primitive, right? Mm-hmm. The ways in which we interact with each other. I mean, even as the guy, the chief from the Jabari tribe, is supposed to be an ape. I mean, most people interpreted that. Well, I know I interpreted that as a Q-Dog call, right? How the film is so, in a sense, for me, very too Black in order to be really African, and the home place that they are drawing from in order to imagine a freedom of defining self, right? And that is the Blackness that I think we're all that we're talking around, right? The Blackness that is not defined by colonization and white supremacy, but the Blackness that is just Black.
Well, Kwanzaa was developed in Black culture, African American culture in particular, drawing from Swahili, Kujichagulia, which means self-determination. And so that's one of the values of a new nation, if you will, that all nations want to define themselves. And so often, Black people, no matter where they are, have been denied the opportunity to define themselves, even as that exercise has never ceased from what you mentioned about the Q-Dog. Now, everybody might not know what that is. Those are the Omega Psi Phi, the fraternity. And on any campus, any HBCU, you can, excuse me, on any HBCU, you can hear that woof woof, okay, that identifies them as who they are, and the dance moves and what have you, the stepping. So, yes.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess I should add, I mean, even as I'm saying that this is Blackness, that, Africanness is also a part of that. It is intrinsically linked and interwoven. I mean, there are some things that, I know that in African American culture, some things that we do that we don't know where it comes from, but it is both generational, intercosmic time travel thing that we go through, that it's, a part of who we are as people who have descended from Africa. And so that Blackness and Africanness are being defined for and by itself.
So what I've heard right in through this segment is that we have kind of two definitions going on. For African people and Black people to have a sense of self-definition. And then there's also an opportunity for persons who are not African or Black, for persons who are part of what we consider to be the majority culture, to learn a new way of defining what is Black as well.
That's right. This is a little bit connected to that, but if you remember the opening sequence, the meteorite that's coming streaking down and it's heading toward the continent of Africa. If you kind of follow its trajectory it seemed to me to land on the equator, approximately where what we'd call Lake Victoria is. So, Uganda and Kenya and Botswana, which, Lake Victoria is itself a colonized name. But that represents really a kind of a heart of Africa. If the Nile headwaters are indeed in Lake Victoria, this is the river that, feeds the many of the cultures and countries in East Africa. But also the use of language throughout the film, bringing in the Tosa language from South Africa and the language out of Nigeria. So you have this imagery of the fertile land of East Africa. Wakanda is kind of representing that with that beautiful river flowing through it, which, maybe this is a representation of the Nile and the nutrients that it represents. You have West African languages, you have South African languages. So it's really intentionally trying to pull together, it seems, a lot of that, the broad continent of Africa into this film.
Yeah, something else that makes me think about when you see the river running through it, and it makes me think of Revelation. Okay, we're saying, is it utopia or is it paradise? All right, and in Revelation, it talks about the city where there's a river that goes through it, and it has the trees that are there for the healing of the nations. Okay, and you have this vibranium and this herb that Amanishakhete talked about that heals the people.